The U.S.-Israel war against Iran is moving fast, and America's footprint in the Middle East is expanding. President Trump announced moments ago that the U.S. launched new airstrikes, this time at Iran's Khark Island. The Pentagon earlier today said it's sending more warships and more military personnel to the region. It's been a busy day, so let's get straight to the panel. Joining us tonight, Steve Inskeep, the host of NPR's Morning Edition. Mark Mazzetti is a Washington correspondent at The New York Times. Felicia Schwartz is a diplomatic correspondent for Politico. And Nancy Youssef is a staff writer and a Pentagon correspondent at The Atlantic. Thank you all for joining us. Busy, busy day. Nancy, I'm going to start with you because the president took to Truth Social just before we came on air, and he announced that the United States Central Command executed one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East and totally obliterated every military target in Iran's crown jewel, Khark Island. He goes on to talk about how they spared the island's oil infrastructure, but that he reserved the right to do so. Explain the significance of this strike.
So Khark Island is only about one-third of the size of Manhattan, but don't let that small size mislead you. It is the cornerstone of the Iranian economy. 90% of its oil exports come out of that island. And so the strikes on it have two big impacts, both military and economic. Let's start with economic. By striking the island, you potentially take oil off of the market, raising already rising Brent crude prices at a time when there's a lot of anxiety about oil reaching $150 or even $200 a barrel. And militarily, the Iranians have threatened that if this island was attacked, they would make it hard for oil to leave the region, threatening to attack oil production and oil facilities in Gulf partner nations, something they've already done, but there's the threat that they would ramp up those strikes with this attack by the United States.
And also a location where there's significant Islamic Revolutionary Guard facilities. You have, it's nicknamed Forbidden Island due to its strict security and restricted access there. And so it seems they're going after the military targets for now, based on the president's Truth Social post.
Right. I mean, as you point out, it has a military value for the IRGC, but it's also a source of revenue for the IRGC as well. And as you note, it's in the Strait of Hormuz, which we've been talking about all week. Its strategic importance to oil exports going through there for the whole world economy. So the fact that there's more instability in such a vital part of the strait only adds to, I think, global anxiety about the pace of this war and the effects it could have on the energy markets.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk more about the Strait of Hormuz. But Felicia, the president has been basically proclaiming victory, even as we continue kind of into the third week of this conflict. Why then would he go over after Khark now? What's the significance of the timing of this particularly?
So what we've seen is that Iran has very, very strategically taken a lot of the leverage, a lot of the power back in this conflict, like Nancy said, with by basically essentially shutting off the Strait of Hormuz, where about a fifth of the world's oil and energy and gas trade moves through. And so he wants to take some of that leverage back. He wants to say to the Iranians, we can, they are still able to move a little bit of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. He wants to be able to say, this is, if we bomb your energy infrastructure totally, it will have huge economic impacts for the Iranian economy. So he wants to see if he can kind of get the Iranians to allow more traffic through the strait. I'm not really sure that's going to work, but he wants to kind of change the balance of power.
And all of this, of course, is coming as the president announces that more troops and more warships are going to the region as well. What do we know about that?
It strikes me that the administration is escalating again and again and again in a way that also threatens the United States. As Nancy was talking, I was thinking about that. If you're striking the Persian Gulf, if you're raising more uncertainty about oil supplies, Iranian oil tankers are among the few that are getting through the Persian Gulf right now. What you effectively do is raise the price of oil and put further burden on the U.S. economy. Now, you are correct that the military appears to be moving another Marine Expeditionary Unit to the Gulf. I've traveled with them in the past. It's a couple thousand or more U.S. Marines, along with helicopters and airplanes and ships and a lot of equipment. They're extremely powerful, but a couple thousand Marines is not very many in the context of a country like Iran. This is something you could imagine sending them to take over an island in the Strait of Hormuz. I don't know what the objective is or if one has even been ordered, but the president is clearly comfortable escalating in a way that entails greater risk for Iran, but also greater risk for the United States and the world.
Nancy, have we gotten specifics on the numbers of troops that are going specifically?
So MU, as the Marines refer to it, has two components, Marines and sailors. This MU has 3 ships, about 2,400 Marines, and then another 2,000 sailors or so 4,000 in all. They're kind of seen as the 911 force of the military in that they can go from ship to shore quickly. They're trained for a multitude of missions. So you could see, we've seen them in the past do things like humanitarian missions, evacuations, but they could also move, as you note, onto an island. They could also support any sort of ground offensive in terms of that sort of initial steps, but we haven't been told what they'll do. I should also note that they are coming from Asia on amphibs, which are very slow-moving ships, so it will take somewhere between 10 days and 2 weeks for them to be in the region. So that tells us that perhaps they're being put in place to create options down the road in this conflict.
Okay, so that's something definitely to watch. So, Mark, President Trump went on Brian Kilmeade's podcast this week, and he said that he would feel it in his bones when this conflict is over. Beyond that, what do we know, or what clarity have we gotten from the administration on what an end to this conflict actually looks like? What would constitute a victory?
Well, it depends on the day or the hour or the minute or whatever interview that the president takes with a different reporter, right? What we've seen over the last 2 weeks is the senior administration officials like Marco Rubio have gone out every day and said there are very clear objectives. We have 3 or 4, depending on the day, to destroy the missile capacity, the Navy, Iran's ability to use proxies around the region. And what constitutes victory is decimating these 4 objectives, right? But then the president comes out and says things like unconditional surrender. We will have, the Iranian regime will collapse. We will have, the United States and President Trump will be picking the new leader, right? So it has depended on, the whims of the president. I can say that the administration is still trying to limit the objectives and not make this look like an endless war. But it's been a mess in terms of the messaging of what this actually looks like, what an endgame actually looks like.
One of the things, Steve, that the administration has insisted is that Iran is essentially cornered now. And even as the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has come out and vowed defiance, they say that they are very much cornered. But at the same time, we're hearing of mines being placed in the Strait of Hormuz that is severely disrupting the shipping lane in ways we've never seen before. Does Iran have a surprising amount of leverage in this conflict to disrupt the global markets in a way that we never really anticipated?
Surprising, I don't know. I think analysts were aware that Iran could close the Strait of Hormuz. And in fact, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, if you like, Pete Hegseth, said in a news conference this week that, of course, they had plans for this. Of course, they were aware that Iran could do this. Nevertheless, Iran seems to have had considerable effect. And you mentioned the mining. I don't know if they're going to succeed in that. I don't know if they have done it, but they haven't really had to do it because the shipping is largely stopped. You can't insure a ship that is going to go through the Persian Gulf, and enough of them have been struck that they have a problem. And this raises a question for me. The president said, I believe to Axios, that he could decide when the war ends. I can quit whenever I want. That's not a direct quote, but effectively that's what he said. And it does raise a question as to whether Iran is willing to go along with that. In the 12-day war last year, the United States was able to say, we're done, we've achieved our objective, Iran will do a retaliatory strike, and it's going to be over. I don't know if that's going to be the case this time, because Iran has played this card that it has threatened to play for decades, and now it's done it, and countries around the world are suffering.
Can I just add?
Yes, please.
Iran is behaving very differently than they did last June. And that has surprised some people in the White House. As you said, it sort of went according to a certain plan where there were attacks. There was one night of strikes by the U.S. Iran retaliated. It was over, right? Iran seems to think this is a far more existential conflict. And so therefore, they're using the leverage that they didn't use the last time, specifically economic leverage, and they're also hitting strikes around the Gulf. And it also raises the question of, even when the war's over, they will have this leverage that they've already shown that they're willing to use, which gives them a certain amount of power in the future.
I mean, I hear you saying, agreeing with Mark, Felicia. Do you feel like the White House was surprised? And if so, why? We know that, for example, they were talking to Israel quite a bit in the lead up to this conflict. You were based in Israel years ago, and you know the country well. What's your sense of the information that they were getting and how much of a reality check they had going into this conflict?
I think, there were Arab diplomats flooding Washington, meeting any official they could meet with, saying it's going to be different this time. Iran needs to change the deterrence calculation. They're going to respond more forcefully. I think there's been plenty of reporting suggesting that they did have, they should have had access to intelligence showing this kind of thing. But I think Trump is kind of a vibes president. He's really taken a lot of lessons from what happened in Venezuela, what happened in the 12-day war. I think Iran and its history and its people is a very different situation than what we saw in Venezuela. And I think, some of it was like, the experts are always wrong. The blob always tells us we can't, this joking diminutive term people use for the foreign policy establishment, that, they told us we couldn't move the embassy in Jerusalem. It was fine. Everyone said the 12-day war is going to be a disaster. Venezuela is going to be a disaster. So I think, Trump has been able to do things that everyone told him he couldn't do. And I think some of it was confirmation bias. It's a small circle of people. And I think, like Steve Witkoff before the talk started, he went on Fox and he said, we're just really surprised the Iranians won't surrender. I think that's a big misunderstanding of the regime and how they operate. So I think it was a bit of just a misread of the situation.
Nancy, you wrote a story this week which was entitled the Iran war has 4 stages and we're in the second. Explain to us what those stages look like, because it also suggests maybe there is an end game in sight. So
there's one on paper anyway.
Yeah.
I wanted to write it too because I think people were asking what the timeline is and what are we seeing. And so in terms of military strategy, it starts with the initial strikes, the initial attacks that we saw, followed by sort of trying to control the territory dominate. When the shift that you've seen in this is rather than using missiles, we're seeing more and more aircraft flying over Iran in a bid to control the airspace. If that goes according to plan, it becomes a stabilization plan and then finally a withdrawal. The phase that we're in right now is that second phase. Now, depending on how the stabilization efforts go, this could be the longest and the most complicated phase of the war. And so when you hear talk about it could be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, those are sort of the phases they're moving through as they go through their target set. And so the question becomes, can they actually stick to that plan? Can they hit those targets? And what does stabilization and withdrawal look like? As we've talked about at this table, there hasn't been a clear answer for what kind of Iran the U.S. would be leaving behind at the end of it. There's no clear sign of regime change, at least as of this week, nor is there a sign of some sort of alternative leadership rising. So a military plan can achieve a weakened military state for Iran. It doesn't guarantee strong governance or a stronger post-period more in line with U.S. or Israeli values afterwards.
The Secretary Hegseth held a couple of press avails this week, although the relationship with the Pentagon and the press under this administration has been pretty complicated. What were the biggest takeaways in your mind? What is the message that they're trying to get out there to the public through the media on this war?
I think twofold, that they know what they're doing despite the mixed messaging in terms of aims and intent, that there is an end state, that the president will decide the timetable of these strikes, that we don't need to tell you the details of what we're doing because that would compromise the operation, and that they have a plan in place to decimate Iran's military capability. What's interesting to me is these press conferences have focused on what's happening in terms of strikes. They have yet to answer to what end. The strikes in and of themselves don't guarantee victory. The U.S. history is filled with examples in which the U.S. achieved tactical wins and lost in terms of the consequence of them. And so they haven't answered that question. So there's been such a focus on how much ordnance we've just destroyed, how much weaker the drone capability is, the ballistic missile capability is, but it hasn't linked it to the strategic aims yet. And I think there's been a real focus on the military ones because it's the most tangible success they can point to right now.
That's a great point.